is pretty robust, so we're going to get started right away. But in this program, we'll be covering everything you need to know to evaluate the preliminary design process of a rooftop solar array. So we'll be covering performance estimates. Welcome to Design Your Solar Roof. I wrote this program to put architects, engineers, contractors, and solar field installers behind the desk of a solar designer. Learn basic project fundamentals while also learning advanced design and installation techniques. My name's John Cromer. I've worked in the solar industry for 10 years. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree. I've also passed the Master Electrician exam and Residential Builder exam in the state of Mississippi, as well as a private industry certification program called NABCEP. Our program outline today is pretty robust, so we're going to get started right away. But in this program, we'll be covering everything you need to know to evaluate the preliminary design process of a rooftop solar array. So we'll be covering performance estimation, economic calculations, array layouts, site assessment techniques, shade analysis, um, sizing the inverter to get the relationship right between the array and the output capacity, different interconnection strategies based on service panel amperage. We'll also show how computer-assisted design promotes the generation of project documentation, as well as some final design and permit documentation techniques. We'll talk about racking sizing, which should give you enough skill to complete a specialty balance of system material between the modules, inverters, and racking. We'll discuss aesthetic considerations to keep your array looking good. We'll talk about some advanced installation techniques called internal conduit runs, which I think are particularly important on residential arrays, but have some merit on commercial rooftops as well. After our solar discussion, we will get into battery sizing, both for off-grid and commercial batteries at a very high level. We will detail modeling building electrical demand a little bit further. Finally, we will conclude the program talking about digital electronic load control and how that can complement on-site renewables and battery storage. Let's perform a PV watts example to determine how much energy a solar array will produce. We'll use PV watts to do this, a free and online resource published by the Department of Energy. The same data is by commercial design software for energy modeling, and so PV watts will tell you much environmental data about the project site under a close look, despite its basic appearance. PV watts makes it easy to get a good idea of how an unshaded solar array will produce its electricity for every hour of the day, every day of the year, based on local weather data. Input your address and system size to get started. I recommend performing a PV watts example using a 1 kilowatt solar array size to keep things simple. We can see that a 1 kilowatt solar array in Houston, Texas, facing due south at a 20-degree roof tilt angle will produce 1,400 kilowatt hours of energy per year. Summer days will produce more than winter days because the days are longer. More closely examine the input data. The roof tilt information button states that a common 512 roof tilt is at a 22-degree tilt angle. The solar array is facing 180 degrees azimuth, which is another way to say due south. A 90-degree angle would face due east. A 270-degree azimuth faces due west. All this can be modeled in PV watts. Now we know enough to run an experiment. Does a due west facing array perform any differently than a due south array? At a 512 roof pitch, the performance difference between solar arrays is 11%. Similarly, the performance difference between south and east is 11%. If the array is at a steeper tilt, for example at a 12-12 roof pitch, which is a 45-degree tilt angle, the performance difference between due south and due east is 20%. Moving north up to Indianapolis, the performance difference between a 45-degree tilt at due south versus due east is 30%. In other words, the orientation of the solar array, or even the tilt angle, does impact array performance, but perhaps not as much as commonly thought. You can find solar arrays bolted 90 degrees down the sides of buildings, such as in New York City, where electricity is expensive and rooftops are cramped, or for off-grid power in Canada to avoid snowfall. Similarly, at a shallow tilt angle, the north side of the roof isn't off limits. So while east and west facing solar arrays are perfectly fine site selection spots, and even north-facing solar arrays in some circumstances are acceptable, most solar in the northern hemisphere faces south. So as far as roof tilt goes, the array will follow the roof. Tilting up off the roof rarely makes sense, especially when the structure is considered. Steep angles will increase solar production, but also increase the installation and operating costs of the system, as the roof will no longer be walkable. If I know for my area, 1 kilowatt of rooftop solar will produce roughly 1,400 kilowatt hours per year, then 1 watt of solar will produce 1.4 kilowatt hours per year. That figure might be discounted 10 to 20% if the tilt angle is atypical, but for the most part, these calculations can be performed mentally in conversation to be later confirmed with a three-dimensional computer model and full shade analysis. But if 1 kilowatt array produces 1,400 kilowatt hours per year, a 5 kilowatt solar array will produce 7,000 kilowatt hours per year. A 5 kilowatt east facing array will produce 11% hours per year instead of 7. A home that uses 11,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, for that matter, will need around an 8 kilowatt solar array, give or take a few watts, to fully offset its energy use. Before leaving PV watts, let's take a final close look. At the very end of the PV watts calculation, the option is presented to download an hourly estimate. Additional site information is revealed, such as the amount of sunlight in the air and on the solar panel itself, as well as roof temperature, ambient temperature, wind speed, and more. All of these factors are being used, along with conservative assumptions about the solar panel itself, to produce an estimate that accounts for both sunny and cloudy days, the changing position of the sun in the sky throughout the day, performance losses due to heat, voltage drop, and system availability. The two major items PV Watts does not account for is shade or snow. So as far as shade goes, I recommend using commercial software to build a 3D model and perform shade analysis based on that. For snow, one simply needs to discount the winter season, perhaps entirely, if it can be expected that snow will sit atop the solar array for an extended period of time each year. The short of it is, by extracting this hourly data into a spreadsheet, the PV Watts data can be used as a foundation for more detailed designs, such as estimating off-grid battery bank capacity, quantifying the economics of selling electricity back to the utility, or evaluating alternate billing rate structures from the electric provider. Calculating solar payback is another essential industry skill. A great starting point is to calculate simple payback, which indicates how many years it will take for project expenses to be recovered. Let's assume you want a 10-year simple payback on your solar project. What should your budget be to achieve this goal?
Let's assume the solar array has an effective generation rate of 10 cents per kilowatt hour. This number largely depends on how much the utility is required to purchase back solar power during the day, particularly if the customer does not have batteries. But for now, let's assume the customer earns 10 cents per kilowatt hour for solar production, regardless of whether it is sold back to the grid or used on site. From the PV watts section, the local production figure comes back into play. A common ratio for much of the United States is that 1 watt of solar will produce 1.4 kilowatt hours of energy per year. Multiplying 1.4 kilowatt hours per year by 10 cents per kilowatt hour lends a new payback metric, 14 cents per watt per year. So if the project needs a 10-year simple payback, then it should have a budget of $1.40 per watt per year to achieve that 10-year payback. The upfront tax credit is commonly included in simple payback calculations. Currently, the tax credit is 30%, set to drop to 26% in 2020 to 2021. After taking the 30% tax credit into account, the project budget should be no greater than $2 per watt to achieve a 10-year payback. According to 2019 solar installation pricing provided by Energy Sage, the average solar installation pricing is closer to $3 per watt. Applying a 30% tax credit, 1.4 kilowatt hours per year per watt production rate, and the 10 cents per kilowatt hour electric rate, the simple payback on a solar array installed at $3 per watt would be 15 years. In other words, simple payback is primarily a function of the production rate of the solar array and the electricity value that the solar array generates. PV watts can be used to determine how solar production value varies somewhat throughout the country. In Reno, Nevada, 1 watt of solar may produce 1.6 kilowatt hours per year. In Buffalo, New York, the same watt of solar on a roof produces closer to 1.2 kilowatt per hours per year, a 25% difference. But the price of electricity, as well as the utility buyback rate for solar power, vary much more widely across the country than the actual solar electric production itself. For this reason, it is safe to assume that the solar power market is primarily driven by the price of electricity, with the amount of sunlight in the air playing second fiddle. Because of the price of electricity, solar has a faster payback in New York City than in Houston, Texas. Despite Houston, Texas having cheaper solar installation costs and better solar production, the simple fact is that New York City electricity pricing costs 2 to 3 times as much as in Houston, Texas, allowing New York solar project economics to fare better despite the higher installation prices and lower system production. Now let's take a look at a typical residential project budget. Solar has dropped in price over the years, but cost reductions in the most recent years have been offset by increases in import tariffs. So, based on Energy Sage pricing, even the 2015 and 2016 project budgets are still a realistic picture of what you can get today, including the import tariffs. In dark blue, the cost of the solar panel itself hovers between 40 cents per watt up to 60 cents per watt, including the price of the import tariff. The panel hard cost is about the same whether or not it's a residential, commercial, or utility scale panel. The markup on the solar panels that a distributor charges, which is more to residential markets than commercial, is modeled up here in gray, which we'll get to shortly. Here's the electrical balance of system material budget. I don't recommend cheaping out on electrical balance of system material, as there's some nice things you can add to a solar array to improve its quality beyond the panel or the inverter itself. A generator bypass switch at the top of the service panel can allow the homeowner to back up power capability for the whole house. Many potential solar owners are surprised to learn batteryless solar does not have the ability to provide power during a blackout, and even battery-based systems typically do not supply the entire house during a blackout. Because battery prices are